Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Ministry of Defence is proposing to change the law to scrap its legal duty of care to servicemen and women in combat. Under the plan, injured personnel and the families of those killed will no longer be able to sue the MOD in the courts for negligence, and compensation will be awarded by an MOD-appointed assessor. The MOD says the proposals are about better compensation and will save injured service personnel and families of those killed long legal battles. But the family of one soldier killed in a lightly armoured snatch Land Rover in Iraq has told the BBC the proposed system is wrong. Our legal affairs correspondent Clive Coleman has the story.
And how old was he when he first started playing the drums?
He was about 9 or 10.
In 2007, Colin Redpath's son, Lance Corporal Kirk Redpath, a keen drummer in the Irish Guards, died when a roadside bomb exploded next to his lightly armoured snatch Land Rover in Iraq.
And I deal with it because I want to be strong for his memory. I mean, some people could literally pull the curtains and never go out, but I'm not like that. And people, you know, say to me, oh, we don't like to mention him to you. I say, no, I'll talk about him. I'm proud of him. He's a fallen soldier.
Kirk was one of some 37 servicemen and women killed in so-called snatch Land Rovers in Afghanistan and Iraq. Colin fought a 6-year legal battle against the Ministry of Defence, eventually winning the right at the Supreme Court to bring an action against the government under human rights law. 3 years later, that case is only now coming to a close.
Good morning, Sir John.
In July 2016, Sir John Chilcott's Iraq inquiry report identified numerous MOD failings in preparing for the Iraq campaign.
The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate.
The report found the military delayed replacing the poorly armoured snatch Land Rovers. The MOD's new proposals cover battle and the preparations for it. They include stopping legal claims for negligence, like those arising from the snatch Land Rovers, against the MOD in the courts. A no-fault compensation scheme for injured service personnel and families of those killed, meaning negligence doesn't have to be proved. Assessors to value injuries and loss based on expert reports they commission. And compensation to be at the same level as if the MOD had been found negligent in court. No one disputes that it's a really good idea for service personnel injured in the course of combat and the families of those who've been killed to be spared long and frustrating legal battles through the courts. But there are real concerns about the Ministry of Defence scrapping the duty of care that it owes to soldiers and taking the system for compensating them in-house.
At the end of the day, they're an employer. You know, the fire brigade, the police, the ambulance service, they all have to go out with equipment that works, and the right equipment. Well, that should be the same for a soldier. I mean, if not, then what the MOD is saying is, well, we could send our boys and girls out with broomsticks. It wouldn't matter. There's no comeback.
And lawyers worry that bypassing the courts creates unfairness.
You've suffered injury. You think that the employer, the organisation, the MOD is at fault, and yet you're asked to rely upon the MOD to assess the compensation that it should pay you for the damage that it has caused you. That's not right.
The proposed scheme assumes service personnel won't need and so won't receive any paid legal representation.
Inevitably there will be trauma, there will be grieving families involved, and the sort of client care that legal representatives provide is absolutely essential in ensuring that those victims are not further damaged by the process.
In a statement, the Ministry of Defence said, "This is about better compensation and, regardless of legal action, we already prioritise learning lessons from any incidents involving the safety of our personnel. Where there have been serious injuries or fatalities, we have robust systems and processes in place that allow us to record and investigate these accordingly.
Obviously, I had the problem of what to do with his ashes, and I didn't want to split them, and I didn't know where I would spread them. So I thought, well, he loved the drums. Let's put them in his cabinet in a drum. And so, you know, his ashes are with me in his cabinet with all his belongings. I couldn't think of anything better, really.
The MOD's consultation on its proposals ends in just over a week. Colin Redpath hopes that for the injured and families of the fallen, the new system ensures maximum safety and fairness.
Well, we can talk now to the president of the Law Society, Robert Burns, who we saw in our report there doesn't support these proposed changes to compensation. Also with us, the Labour MP Madeleine Moon, who is on the MP's Defence Select Committee, and we're also joined by the Conservative MP and former Army officer Ian Duncan-Smith, who does support the changes. Madeleine Moon, you've said previously that you believe the MOD is the most unaccountable department of government. How do you see these changes?
I'm very worried about these changes. It's a very short report. It doesn't tell you very much, which is the government's way of doing things now. Tell you as little as possible and then legislate for as much as possible so that you can't prepare your case in advance. I think it is very worrying that, given the cuts that we've had in our armed forces over the last few years, the quality of the equipment is deeply worrying, and now they're going to give themselves immunity from failing to provide the quality of equipment and the quality of training that they should provide before people go into combat. I'm very worried about that.
Ian Duncan-Smith, immunity for the MOD from failing is how Madeleine Moon sees it.
Well, as I say, there's a balance in these things, that it's not all perfect by any means. I have historically been concerned about the growing nature of the use of courts when it comes to combat issues. It doesn't seem to me like the courts are the right place to be. Issues surrounding combat are often very difficult to judge against a standard common law process. So I think there is and are grounds for changing this process to try and make the thing much simpler, less costly to those who engage in it, and costly in human terms, but at the same time also making sure that the right outcomes are derived. And therefore, whilst I am in general support of the idea of making this simpler and better in many senses for those concerned, of course I would want to see that this is open as possible. The assessor's role is therefore very critical, and the linkage with the Select Committee would be, I would like to see bound in on this. So in other words, that I think it would be a very strong role for the MOD, for the Select Committee, to be able to constantly interrogate and have open to it all the documents that are necessary to be able to figure out whether or not the assessor's judgments are balanced and fair, and whether or not the MOT is in essence hiding anything. But I think dragging things through the courts satisfies only lawyers. At the end of the day, it makes things worse. I would want to see the MOD come clean much more often early on, when they've made mistakes and got it wrong, and thus the assessors could then judge it.
Okay, well, we'll put the issue of maybe lawyers only being satisfied in a moment to the lawyer with us in the studio. But I just want to put back to you, actually, Madeleine Moon, the point that Ian Duncan-Smith was saying about the Select Committee having powerful oversight potentially. Would that be enough?
That's fine in practice. But what are we talking about? Are we talking about the Select Committee looking at individual cases? Because I don't think we're equipped for that. We don't have the capability to do that. Mm-hmm. But also, you know, a Select Committee should be there to challenge government. And I have to tell you, just in a recent case in relation to IHAT, we challenged the Secretary of State to close down the IHAT inquiry. And he told us it wasn't possible. He didn't have the right to do that, that the cases that were before them were the most complex and difficult that they had to deal with. And then the day before we were releasing our report, he announced he was closing the inquiry down. He'd suddenly found powers. Now, you can't trust the Ministry of Defence, I'm afraid,
In the end, if it's
to tell you the truth.
If it's better for servicemen and women and their families in that it streamlines a process that when someone has been through a trauma and they have to fight through the courts, that's not good for anybody. If it makes that better and they get compensation at the level that they would have done had they won their case through the court in a simpler process, is that the right thing?
Well, there's two sides to that. In terms of the personal trauma, that's fine. Whether or not you're going to get the understanding and the lessons learned, and quite honestly, expose the failures of preparation and equipment, is another issue altogether. So there is also, and I think the father that you spoke to earlier said it absolutely wonderfully, there's also that feeling of justice. Now, is the Ministry of Defence really going to use this as a way of burying its failures? They're very good at doing it, and I just worry this is just another opportunity to do so.
Robert, you're the president of the Law Society. Yes. Just picking up on what Ian Duncan-Smith said there about the only people that the court process satisfies in the end is lawyers.
The situation here is actually we are concerned for the service personnel. And clearly there will be some cases where a compensation scheme that operates effectively and quickly is fine. But actually what is really concerning here is the proposal, and it's in very vague terms within the consultation document, that combat immunity should be extended. Nobody is suggesting that decisions taken in the heat of battle by a commanding officer should be subject to scrutiny in court, alleging negligence. What we are concerned about is the extension of combat immunity to include preparation and training. And that would mean that people could not then allege negligence. And this is more than just compensation. You heard from the Mr. Redpath in relation to his son. He wasn't so much interested in compensation. What he wanted to know was that somebody independent was looking at this issue and making a decision. And it's shutting people out of that justice process, forcing them into a compensation system, and actually denying them the opportunity to say this was negligent. And as I say, people want, time and time again, the cases that have come before the courts are about things other than what happened in combat. It's the preparation, it's the training, it's the equipment. And people should be entitled, shouldn't they?
Ian Duncan-Smith, why should it be extended to not just what happens on the battlefield, but obviously the preparation?
Well, just in an answer to Madeleine's point, and I don't disagree with her, you know, historically the MOD has never had a great record of admitting its own failures and faults. You know, I served in the army. My father, I remember telling me about what happened in the aftermath of the Second World War. And yet with all of this process of kind of court cases going on, litigious nature of things that are happening, Madeleine is still rightly complaining about their failure to open up. And if anything, I think sometimes what happens with government, and having served in it, is when you come under pressure about people taking legal action, governments shut up. They actually literally get worse about hiding stuff. So the key things to me are this. I do want to see when government and when the military make a mistake that is something they should not have made, in other words, rectify a problem that they had arrived at through training or even through bad decisions over equipment, I would want to see that publicly come out. And I think, therefore, the two roles here are really important. That's why I don't give this a blank check. I simply say, in principle, I am supportive of it. The two roles are the independent assessor.
Sorry to interrupt, because I hear what you're saying about, you know, your hope that without a fear of legal action and accepting liability and therefore losing through the courts, government, the MOD, may open up more, but that's a hope, isn't it? I mean, there's no guarantee on that. And when you look at situations in the past, like with the snatch Land Rovers, if there hadn't been complete transparency and openness on that, sort of forced in some cases through legal action, what might have happened?
Well, there are lots of issues, and you can debate about the use of those Land Rovers. You know, they were being used in Northern Ireland when I was serving in Northern Ireland as well, and often they thought at the time that they were simply not adequate. The point that I'm making, though, is the key element to this is the role and choice of the assessor. How public are they, how accountable are they, and how independent? And the other one is, it's very, very important that the coroner's role in this is constantly upheld. In other words, they don't override the idea. So the coroner has full power still, that's what I want to see, to be able to point the finger during the course of that process, and then that kicks the assessor into action. If you lose the coroner's sense, then I would certainly not support this.
It's a good point, isn't it? That the coroner's courts obviously are still there.
The coroner's courts are still there and quite honestly have been pretty critical in exposing many of the failures of the Ministry of Defence in relation to equipment. But they're being asked to extend their role and responsibility outside of their technical competence. So why would you do this? I agree with the point of making it a simpler process so that you shouldn't always have to be getting yourself lawyered up to seek your rightful compensation. What worries me is that this is skewed towards the Ministry of Defence, and I question the impartiality of the people who are going to be set up to do these assessments. The Ministry of Defence is a very seductive place. You can get sucked into seeing everything from their perspective if you're not careful. They do dislike telling you even the most simple of information, and they hide behind official secrets all the time.
Might that evaporate if there's no fear of legal action, as Ian Duncan-Smith was saying potentially?
I'll give you an example. A colleague asked twice why the Queen Elizabeth carrier was not going to go for sea trials in the spring and the date had been changed to the summer. Twice he was fobbed off. So I had the Minister in front of me in the Select Committee and I asked her the same question. And she said, oh, it's a misunderstanding of when spring was. Spring could actually be in June. Now, I pushed and I pushed and I pushed, and I was told eventually there's a bit of a technical problem. After the meeting, someone came to see me and said, it's a bit of IT that's gone wrong, that's all it is. Now, I mean, they won't tell you anything. They are the great hiders of problems.
I'm not alone in
Robert Bourne, do you think that the fear of litigation does kind of lead to situations escalating potentially?
It's always unfortunate if people are responded to litigation by making the claimant fight every inch of the way. All I'd say in this is, in 1987, in fact, the definition of combat immunity was limited to the battlefield, post-Falklands. And one of the things that's said in one of the reports that leads to this consultation paper, a report from 2013 by one of Ian Duncan-Smith's colleagues, said that at that time there were concerns that compensation was inadequate. So that was without the threat of litigation, it was inadequate. And there were concerns also coming through in relation to the way in which service personnel had been put in harm's way in relation to nuclear testing in the 1950s. And it was thought appropriate to give them the right to pursue claims for negligence. And we don't want to see that right now restricted. And yes, we would like an open environment where people are prepared to admit their mistakes, absolutely. And as I say, in certain circumstances, compensation schemes will work in favour of the service personnel. But if you think you have been injured or your family member has been lost, suffered, has been killed as a consequence of some failure back up the line, you will have a right to pursue that, and you should have a right to pursue that. That's our point.
Ian Duncan-Smith, you wanted to come in.
No, I was only saying that I'm not, by no means, completely at ease with everything here. I think, as I said earlier on, I understand the principle. And I think the whole idea of the idea of going to court does not satisfy people who have to do it, because I said it forces then the MOD, most other government departments having served in them, do exactly the same. As they shut up, they become defensive. What I'm really keen is two things that are very important in this. First, that ultimately this process is swifter and satisfies more people in the sense that they can get what they need done, and the compensation is paid out quickly. The second bit, though, is very important, which is the checks and balances that exist through the coroner and through the independent assessor mean, this is what has to happen, that therefore there is early acceptance of fault, and therefore that early acceptance stops the heartache that goes on for soldiers, sailors and airmen and their families in the event of a problem. If that doesn't get satisfied, then these processes should not continue. But I believe there is scope for that to happen. I'd like to see the MOD make sure
So
that
what
that's the case.
these processes should not continue, then you're saying that potentially it goes back to as it is?
Well, my point is the checks that they talk about, the independent assessor and the coroner, and the ability and willingness to admit early that there has been a mistake is critical if this consultation then is to work. If those aren't there, then it won't work. So that's the key test for this, and therefore we will see exactly how they intend to make the assessor's position all-powerful.
I would simply add that it's open to the MOD to admit fault in a litigation, if they want to, at an early stage, rather than putting the personnel through the effort of years and years of litigation through an independent court.
What did you, sorry, Ian Duncan-Smith, you said that they're not going to do that.
I said, you know, the MOD, once legal cases begin, they shut up, like everybody does, because they worry of the knock-on, the effect that it has in different numbers of people, and therefore their ability to control the way in which that process works. It's an instinctive thing, you've seen it many times. My point is, I'm after that stopping. If this process allows us to get to early identification of the problem, if there is fault, where the fault lies, and therefore what compensation support for families, then it's got to be in the interests of families and those service personnel. If it doesn't work like that, then of course it shouldn't go ahead.
Okay. I know you want to make quick final thoughts.
Just out of time. Coroners have been increasingly dragged into looking at issues of deaths in relation to the Ministry of Defence. There are whole questions, and it'll be interesting to see what the Chief Coroner says about this, about their competence, their training and their understanding of military equipment and military personnel and the training that they require to be able to protect the Ministry of Defence from combat immunity. That's a whole different area of expertise that currently doesn't lie with coroners.
Thank you all very much indeed for your thoughts on this. Well, let's get some reaction now to the proposed changes. We're joined by Patrick Hennessy, a barrister and former Army captain who thinks this will make the MOD less accountable. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon spent 23 years in the military and thinks this is a good thing for veterans and the MOD. Val O'Neill also joins us. Her son Chris was killed in 2007 while serving in Iraq as part of the Royal Army Medical Corps. And Simon Harmer lost both legs in Afghanistan in 2009 and joins us too. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Val, tell us what actually happened for your family after Chris was killed in terms of compensation.
The compensation was with life. It was quickly dealt with, but not as well as it could have been. I'm more interested in the duty of care that the MOD should have. Chris was killed in a warrior. In the Shilcott report in 2003, the warrior condemned for not having any protection on the underneath of it. Chris was killed in 2007 and still the warrior had no protection, even though in 2003 the MOD said they were putting protection underneath the warrior. So therefore the duty of care did not exist.
We're struggling to hear a little bit because of a bad line, so I'm just going to move away from you for a moment, but we'll hope that the line gets better and we'll come right back to you. But let me bring in Simon Harmer, because Simon, you lost both of your legs in Afghanistan in 2009. What is your view on duty of care, compensation, and whether people should have the right to go through the courts to get redress from the MOD?
Well, I do think that there needs to be an independent sort of body that looks after us. When I was initially injured, I had to go through the process myself. I had the support of Blesma, the veteran charity, and if it wasn't for them, I would have really struggled. And I know that things were missed from my compensation.
Did you feel you had to fight?
There wasn't that feeling at that time, but I think the support that I had around me, i.e. from the charity, if it hadn't been there, then I would have struggled. And if I'd been on my own, I would have struggled.
So now these changes are being proposed. It's just a proposal. What do you think? Would it be better for soldiers or not?
I am worried. I'll be honest with you. I think that taking away outside influence or an independent body isn't a positive move. I also think that if there's no redress or no appeal process, it could leave servicemen and women shortchanged.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, you have lengthy experience in the military. You think this is a good idea. Why do you think that?
Well, I think anything that improves the lot of the men and women in the forces who goes to war is to be something that we should appreciate and go forward. I mean, not only did I do 23 years in the British military, The last 5 years, I've been with the Peshmerga in northern Iraq and also working in Syria with hospitals, entirely of my own choice, but without that military backing. And I think when a soldier, when he or she goes into combat, and you really have to have been in combat to understand it properly, number one, you want to have the best medical facilities available to sort you out if you get injured. And I think, we do probably now in the military have that, British military. Number two, you want to make sure that if you are killed, your family and friends are looked after properly. And some of the stories we've heard hitherto about people having to go through long, lengthy legal process to get money is absolutely disgraceful. So if this, and it is a consultation, this gives money to the people who require it at the very highest levels, then I think it is to be encouraged and looked at. It is a consultation. But I think further, the Chilcot inquiry that we've mentioned, and also the IHAT, the Iraq Historic Abuse Inquiry, has broken in somewhat the covenant, the army covenant, the military covenant, that deal that civilians and politicians in this country have with the British military. And that needs to be enhanced. And I am concerned that MPs, and I've met rather a lot recently with my activities in Syria, are rather stymied by the desire to make sure that legally everything is absolutely right before they commit us to military action, which at the end of the day is what our British Armed Forces
Patrick Hennessy, in the end, if it stops somebody who has been through a trauma, whether it's they have been injured or whether it's families of somebody that they have lost, if it stops them having to go through a lengthy legal process and they in the end get compensation at the level that they would have done had they had to go through that fight, is that a good thing for them?
I think the important thing to recognise is that can happen speedily now if the MOD isn't fighting the claim. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there is a problem here, and there's a problem here that needs to be addressed. And it was said in one of your reports that the MOD is an employer like any other. And the problem is it's not. Because ultimately, when you go to war, there is an enemy. And the enemy is trying to kill and injure you. And that is what is fundamentally different about soldiering to any other walk of life. And the principle of combat immunity has to recognise that. And I recognise there is a problem, and this is the MOD trying to address it. But my concern is in the detail. So, for example, it is said in the consultation there may be an independent assessor for eligibility, but that might be done in-house. So that could mean the MOD is entitled to look at the claim and say, we don't think you have a claim at all. Where is the right of appeal to that? If the MOD allows your claim, it is then said, we imagine the MOD will normally agree with an independent assessor on the value of your claim. Well, it's quite conceivable that the MOD won't agree, and there is very little detail currently on what would happen in that circumstance. You might have a 19-year-old soldier who's been terribly injured, who maybe doesn't have the background, sophistication, the family resources to be able to challenge what the MOD is saying. He may have a right of appeal to an appeals tribunal. But you can see how these things will spiral into exactly the same sort of delay that is occurring now without the independent scrutiny. I think that was really important that everybody mentioned there is the importance of independence, because you can't be your own judge and jury. And
Val, I wanted to come back to you because you were talking about, obviously, the concerns with your situation, with your son, the vehicle that he was travelling in. And the importance of lessons being learned. I mean, the Ministry of Defence says it is good at learning lessons from any incident involving safety of personnel. Does that reassure you?
No, it doesn't, because 4 years down the line and the Warrior vehicle was still the same as they were saying in 2003. How can that reassure you when 4 years later the vehicle is still in the same condition it was and is still as dangerous?
What do you feel is the best way to hold the MOD to account on things like that? I mean, is it the courts? Is it something else? There is still, of course, the coroner's court.
There is the coroner's court, and at Chris's inquest, the coroner actually asked the question why there was no protection on the underbelly. I've asked repeatedly of the MOD for proof that protection has been put underneath these Warrior vehicles, but they have never replied to me. So where was their duty of care then, when it was recommended in 2003 that this be done? In 2007, it still hadn't been done.
And On the issue of lessons being learned, Patrick Hennessy, I mean, do you believe, I mean, obviously you're a barrister, you've got a vested interest in a way in obviously legal claims being pursued, but do you believe that the courts process does mean there is greater accountability, or is it possible that accountability is had through greater MPs' scrutiny and the coroner's court?
Well, yeah, I think this is actually really interesting because I don't necessarily think either the courts process or the proposed compensation process deal with sort of issues that are being raised there. There is a difference between the compensation that should be awarded to servicemen who are killed and injured and what I would characterise as kit issues, and the duty of care to individual servicemen may not be the same thing as operational effectiveness. And this is a great example of one of the really difficult decisions that militaries have to make. Sometimes the most important thing when looking at a vehicle, for example, might not be the level of protection it affords, it might be its mobility, it might be its firepower. And it doesn't seem to me that either the courts process currently or this proposed scheme would deal with that aspect. That is something that is more properly dealt with by politicians.
Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you.
I've been getting